This talk is about three large houses and adjoining deer parks, once the defining feature of Enfield, and which were created due to the rich hunting in the area. I want to begin this talk with an extract from one of the greatest works of medieval English literature, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Written in the late 14th century in a northern dialect of English, it describes the arrival at the court of King Arthur at New Year of a mysterious Green Knight who challenges the knights to a test of bravery. Sir Gawain takes up the challenge, at which point the knight commands that Gawain sever his head with an axe. Having done as instructed, the Green Knight picks up his head and heads off on his horse, instructing Gawain that in order to keep his promise, he must attend the knight's castle a year hence for the challenge to be reciprocated and Gawain's promise kept. Later that year, determined to keep his promise so as not to break a chivalric vow and thereby be disgraced, Gawain sets off to find the Green Knight's home. This scene, from line 764, describes Gawain's arrival at the castle of Sir Bertilac. The original alliterative Middle English is on the left, and the modern English translation in the green box on the right. He discovered a castle enclosed with a moat, above a laund, on a hill, framed under boughs, of many huge tree trunks surrounded by ditches. A castle, the comeliest that knight ever owned, perched on a plain, a park all about, with a pointed palisade, planted full thick, that encircled many trees for more than 2 miles. This part of the poem tells us a lot about medieval chivalry of relevance to Enfield. Firstly, moats served as both a defensive purpose and later also to enhance the status of the owner. A laund is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a grassy plain or pasture for grazing deer, surrounded by trees, a glade. This is the origin of the modern English word lawn, as in short-mown grass. We can find references to lawns across Enfield Chase, as we'll see in a later talk. The reference to a park within the poem is not a public park in the modern sense, but in the medieval sense of a private hunting park, another major status symbol for the owner. As set out in line 769 of the poem, such parks were often surrounded by pointed palisades or fences, both to keep the deer in, but also to keep would-be poachers out. The etymology of the word lawn in the original sense of deer pasture can be seen in the map of 1776 on the left, which shows the Great Lawn or Laund north of West Lodge, in the same location as the depiction of the hunt on the right, which we saw previously in Talk 2. During the 18th century, the concept of a lawn evolved into a key feature of the landscapes produced by famous designers such as Humphrey Repton and Capability Brown. Lawns provided pleasing vistas framed by veteran trees and across artfully positioned lakes and ponds. This map shows South Lodge, for a while the home of William Pitt the Elder, who as well as Prime Minister was another noted landscape designer. The same principles were carried through to the design of Trent Park, which, after existing as an aristocratic retreat and miniature deer park, became a public park in 1973. In this way, the origins of the modern public park can be traced back through designed landscapes to the aristocratic passion for deer parks and hunting. Across England in medieval times there were a large number of deer parks, with some estimates suggesting that at their peak in the 13th century there may have been around 3,000 of them. This map of Middlesex from the early 17th century shows a number of parks, rendered in green and surrounded by pointed palisades, as described in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The area of Enfield Chase is shown within this blue box to the northern part of the Middlesex county. Labels can be seen for Enfield Chase and also Edmonton 100, the old administrative area within which the chase was situated, and to which the northern edge of the chase formed the boundary of both county and hundred. Some of these deer parks later became public parks, for example Bushy Park, Hyde Park, and the park then known as Mary Bone, and later becoming known as Regent's Park. This Elizabethan map of Enfield shows a number of interesting features. The Middlesex boundary is highlighted in yellow. Adjacent to Enfield Chase, St Andrew's Church is represented by a symbol. To either side of the church are shown two parks, shaded in green, surrounded by a pale or fence. These two deer parks were created hundreds of years apart, but were both in use at the time of publication of this map in 1593. The park to the southeast of the church is now called Old Park. This map on the right shows the boundaries of Old Park, which adjoined the Chase at World's End to the west and Slades Hill to the north. Salmon's Brook flows through the park, and the Ranger's House formed the administrative centre for park officials. Ranger's House, although much altered over the years, is still in use as the clubhouse of Bush Hill Park Golf Club. Enfield Manor House was situated on the edge of Old Park, located so as to provide easy access into the park for hunting trips. The moated site, shown here, has somewhat mysterious origins, but is thought to be central to understanding Old Park, as we'll see in a minute. The Domesday Book entry for Enfield, shown here, tells us a lot about the early history of the area. Of note is the reference to Geoffrey de Mandeville, one of William the Conqueror's powerful barons, who controlled this area and much other land besides. The text also says Parc est ibi, meaning there is a park, in Latin. Scholars believe that this reference must refer to Old Park. There are only 36 references to parks in the Domesday Book, and this means that Enfield Old Park is one of a small group of late Anglo-Saxon deer parks. In Anglo-Saxon times these were known as Haga or Gehaga, which simply means an enclosed piece of land. This later became shortened to Hay. In Norman times, some parks became known as Le Frith or Wood, and this, indeed, was the term used to describe Enfield Old Park. The entry goes on to state in Latin, Tenuit Ansgar Staller Regis EDW. From this we know that Enfield Old Park was held by Ansgar, who held the high courtly office of Staller to King Edward the Confessor. It is this long history that's referenced in a number of street names in modern Enfield. This modern map of Enfield shows the areas of developed and undeveloped land. Bush Hill Park Golf Course, Enfield Golf Course and Town Park, between them comprise the remnants of Enfield Old Park, which in some medieval documents was referred to in Latin as the Parcus Intrinsicus, or interior park, to differentiate it from the later Enfield Chase, which from the year 1140 became the Parcus Extrinsicus, or outer park. The route of some of the original tracks through the Chase can also be traced from old maps, as we saw in the first talk, including World's End Lane and the Merry Hill Way, which form the boundary between Old Park and the Chase. What would the interior of Old Park have looked like? It would probably have comprised areas of woodland interspersed with open lawns, or areas for deer to graze. The park would have been compartmented, or split into different areas or compartments, which would enable areas to recover from deer grazing. As we saw in the previous talk, this photograph shows the view from Enfield Golf Course across part of what was once Old Park in the foreground, looking toward Enfield Chase at Trent Park in the background. Slopes such as this were ideal for bow and stable hunting within deer parks, and would involve beaters driving deer down into the valley bottom. At the bottom, the hunting party would be waiting with their bows and arrows. At the bottom of this slope are the remains of the medieval parkkeeper's house, now a scheduled ancient monument. This photograph shows the medieval moated site within Enfield Golf Course, now a scheduled ancient monument. The remains include the ditch once forming the moat and banked enclosures forming a platform upon which a medieval structure, probably the house of the keeper of Old Park, once stood. The moat may have served as a status symbol and perhaps also as protection against violent bands of would-be deer stealers. Could the moat have looked like Leatheringham Lodge in Suffolk, a hunting lodge surrounded by a moat? The truthful answer is that we just don't know. The park pale or fence would have been created from long straight poles, grown through a method known as coppicing, which involved cutting trees near ground level. The trouble with coppicing was that deer would nibble the regrowth, preventing new poles from forming, and so within parks the preferred method of growing poles was called pollarding, or cutting off poles above head height beyond the reach of the deer. This picture of a magnificent pollard is from Northall Great Wood to the north of Enfield Chase. West of Enfield town, off Slade's Hill, is a small housing estate called Postern Green. The word postern refers to a rear gate, in this case a gate into Old Park, and possibly also onto the adjacent chase, as shown in this map of the chase from 1658, which indicates the broad location with reference to the windmill on Windmill Hill. This map of Windsor Little Park shows a similar feature called Little Postern, and also another feature called a deer leap, which spans the park pale, but although not shown in Enfield, almost certainly existed at some point. A deer leap allowed deer to enter a park but not to leave, and was therefore a good way of restocking a park from a wider forest. It has also been argued that Old Park was used to restock the adjacent Enfield Chase, making the park a nursery for young deer. This map of Enfield in 1879 illustrates the relationship between the old manor house, shown here as the Palace School, and Old Park. In 1902, the land was purchased by public subscription to create the town park. But for hundreds of years, up until around the year 1650, this area was the edge of the old deer park, which adjoined the manor. Roman coins were found at Oldbury during excavations in 1902, indicating that it may have been the site of a Roman villa. It may also be that this was the site of the original manor of Enfield, for which in 1322 Edward III granted permission to Humphrey de Bohun to fortify. Unfortunately, further archaeology is complicated by the fact that the site is now occupied by a supermarket. The young poet John Keats, who attended Clark's Academy, where the station now stands, recounts climbing on the remains of Oldbury next door, and I have it on the authority of the biographer of Keats that in his poem Ode to a Nightingale, the reference to forests dim is likely an allusion to Enfield Chase. This picture from 1778 shows the west front of Enfield Manor as it appeared then. It was only briefly used by royalty, and the name Palace is a popular local name rather than a proper historical term for the manor house. Prior to excavation of Elsing Palace in the 1960s, historical documents referring to Enfield House were often mistakenly thought to refer to the manor house, rather than the larger palace a couple of miles to the north. This photograph from the tower of St Andrew's Church across the Market Square in 1905 shows the house behind the gates onto Church Street, with the impressive cedar of Lebanon behind, which was planted by Dr. Uvedale in the 17th century when he was headmaster of Enfield Grammar School. The magnificent cedar at Forty Hall was planted around the same time. By the time of this photograph, the manor house was much reduced in size, with original wings to the house having been demolished in the 18th century. Having briefly served various purposes including as a school and as a post office, the manor house was finally pulled down in 1928. The site is now occupied by Pearson's department store and the wider grounds by a shopping centre appropriately named Palace Gardens. Before it was demolished, the oak panelling and fireplace from one of the rooms in the manor was salvaged and erected within a specially constructed outhouse at No. 5 Little Park Gardens. Usually referred to as the Tudor Room, this magnificent room, part of a private house adjacent to Gentleman's Row, is the grandest survival from the time of the Royal Chase. On either side of the fireplace are the letters E and R, thought to refer either to Elizabeth Regina or to Edwardus Rex. Elizabeth Regina is a reference to Queen Elizabeth I, and Edward Rex to her younger brother, the short-lived King Edward VI. Edward and Elizabeth spent some time at Enfield Manor as children, as well as at other houses, including Elsing, Hatfield, and Hunsdon. This painting by Hans Holbein in 1546 shows Prince Edward, and through the window a glimpse of the hunting lodge at Hunsdon House. Hunsdon House is just outside the modern town of Harlow, about 15 miles away. This picture illustrates how hunting was seen as a vital part of the education of young princes and the sons of noblemen. It was valued for teaching the martial values of warfare and required great skill and courage. The picture hangs in the staterooms at Windsor Castle and shows Henry, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of James I, together with a friend. Henry sadly died of typhoid at the age of 18. Between the two boys is a wooden gate and a fence of a hunting park, and a grand residence in the background. The picture therefore further illustrates the connection between hunting parks, palaces, and the nobility, which is so important to understanding the history of Enfield's houses and the chase. Travel between hunting lodges was a central feature of the life of a medieval monarch and their court. This map reconstructs the journeys of the itinerant court during the reign of King John. There were three main reasons for the constant movements of the medieval royal courts. Firstly, to exercise control over the barons and to remind the people of the king's power and reach. Secondly, the practicalities of sustaining a large retinue of courtiers, since food supplies and sanitation were only capable of supporting such large numbers of people for a short time. The final reason was to pursue good hunting, which depended on the season and the stock of deer. As this map shows, there was a strong correlation between hunting forests and the location of the king's houses. The king possessed a large number of residences that were not castles and were variously termed palaces, hunting lodges, and houses. Most residences had more than one function, and hunting lodges could equally be used to conduct royal business and administration, as well as hosting guests or serving as private retreats. The second, much later deer park, to the north and east of Old Park, is also shown surrounded by a pale in Norden's map of 1593. This second park was variously called Little Park, New Park, and Elsing Deer Park. This modern plan reconstructs the boundaries of the park, indicating the area of Little Park around Elsing Palace, on the eastern edge of Enfield Chase. The park was probably created by Henry VIII around 1539, around the same time he acquired Elsing Palace. This is a reconstruction of Elsing Palace based on archaeology carried out by the Enfield Archaeological Society. Much larger than Enfield Manor, documentary sources also refer to this as Enfield House, located in the grounds of Forty Hall. The house is believed to have medieval origins, but Sir Thomas Lovell, Chancellor of the Exchequer and leading minister to Henry VII, is generally credited with establishing Elsing as a courtier's palace. The house was visited several times during the reign of Henry VII, who was attracted in part to its prime location next to the hunting forest of Enfield Chase. Following Lovell's death in 1524, the palace passed into the hands of the Earl of Rutland. Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, made several hunting trips with Rutland from Elsing in the 1520s. Henry eventually acquired the house in 1539 and quickly set about upgrading it to a fully fledged royal residence, one of several that were intended mainly for the use of his children, especially his young son Edward. Subsequent monarchs had difficulty maintaining the large collection of properties Henry had built up during his lifetime, and despite periodic efforts at renovation, Elsing fell into disrepair and disuse. Unlike the great palaces such as Greenwich and Whitehall, Lesser palaces such as Elsing served two main purposes. They provided secluded retreats where the king could escape from the pressures of state and indulge his passion for hunting with just a few favourite courtiers. And they also provided a sheltered environment for the three royal children, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth, away from London with its ever-present threat of disease. Records suggest that Elsing was sometimes used as a Christmas retreat for the royal family. On the 28th of January 1547, it was while staying at Elsing that Edward and his sister Elizabeth were informed of the death of their father, Henry VIII. It was at Elsing that Edward first knew he had become King Edward VI. Historical records from Elsing provide some evidence of the nature of hunting at Little Park. Documents refer to a standing, perhaps similar to that shown here in Windsor Little Park. A standing was a wooden structure from which hunters would shoot at deer driven towards them. Standings could be quite substantial structures, such as this, known as Queen Elizabeth's Hunting Lodge in Epping Forest. Most were rather more simple affairs, such as this. This is a conjectural reconstruction of Theobald's Palace, the third and by far the grandest of the royal houses related to Enfield Chase. It was here that King James I was received by the royal household and court on his journey south from Scotland in 1603, and here that he died in 1625, his son Charles being proclaimed king at the palace's gates. An academic study by Emily Cole in 2017 concluded that there can be no doubt that had Theobald survived, it would now be one of the most notable and admired 16th century country houses in England, rated at least as highly as buildings such as Burghley House, Kirby Hall and Hardwicke Hall. The palace was dismantled during the Commonwealth period shortly after 1650. Only a small number of fragments of the palace remain. Perhaps the most impressive of these remains is this wall in Theobald's Lane, which is a small part of a wall which by 1620 extended over 9 miles in circumference, enclosing parts of Enfield Chase for the king's private use, as his own personal deer park around the palace. As can be seen in this photograph, the wall stood 9 feet high enough to keep the deer in. This picture gives a good idea of what the deer park at Theobald's might have looked like. James I, like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, was a fanatical hunter and loved Theobald's for the hunting in the adjacent forest of Waltham, what we now know as Epping Forest, and Enfield Chase, as well as in his own deer park. The rise of Theobald's paralleled the decline of Elsing, a fact that was not universally welcome. This fascinating letter, written by Sir Vincent Skinner, one-time resident of Enfield Manor House, relates an incident regarding a gathering of local women at Castlegate, on the edge of the chase. Determined to prevent firewood being taken out of the chase to supply Theobald's, the women were openly defiant when Sir Robert Wroth was sent to investigate. To the women, Elsing was not only a source of pride in the local area, but was also a significant employer. The women demanded that the wood should be used for the airing of Elsing, in other words, for a fire to keep damp and mould at bay. This transcription gives some idea of the difficulty of deciphering the text. It reads as follows: "May it please your honour, Sir Robert Wroth and I, according to which your pleasure signified, repaired to Enfield on Wednesday at night last, and early the next morning resorted to Whitewebs, a place bordering upon the chase, where we found no such company of women as we expected, the most of them being departed to their houses to take their rest, and thereupon rode towards Castlegate, where the women had assembled, and continued day and night in great numbers from Monday last, and there we found some dozen or thereabout, whom we demanded the cause of their first assembling and continuance there, and received this answer, that for maintenance of their custom and right, that the chase would, should not be carried out of the town of Enfield, but spent in the king's house, for airing whereof it was appointed, and which for lack of airing was like to fall to ruin. Thanks for listening. The next talk will be about the key events in the history of the chase.